Today I'm going to go over in detail 6 areas using Linux that I talked about in my previous video. This is geared toward starting a career in Linux administration, but also for home users that feel like using Linux is a scary idea. I did break this video up into chapters, so if you need to skip ahead, you can check out the description for timestamps. If you'd like to follow along with me, the best option is to install VirtualBox. It runs on Windows, Linux, and Mac OS. Alright, let's get started. I'm going to install Debian for this demo. You have different installation options. I'm going to go with the graphical install. And then you can choose your language, your location, and the keyboard layout. And it's going to go through and detect the hardware, detect the network card, set up for a DHCP so we can get an IP address. Okay, time out for a second. I'm sure you've noticed I've sped things up if you're following along, so you'll have to pause pretty frequently. Okay, let's resume. Enter in the host name for this system and the domain name if needed. This is not required though, you can leave it blank. And then the root password. This is the super user that has full permissions on the system. We'll enter in the name for a standard user. And then we'll enter in the username for that account. And then we'll choose a password for that new user account. And then we'll set our time zone. And now it's going to detect the hard disks that are on the system for us to partition so we can install. And there are different options. Guided sets the partitions for you. It does all the hard work. So you can use the entire disk. You can use the entire disk and set up LVM, which is Logical Volume Manager, which means you can add disks later on, you can add space later on. And then the encrypted option is for business. So if you lose your laptop, your data is encrypted. And we're going to use the LVM option. And then we're going to choose the disk that it detected. And you have different options here. You can separate your home partition so your data is separate from your operating system. You can set partitions for log files, configuration files, installation files, but we're just going to use one partition for everything. And I have existing data on here, so I'm going to wipe that and start fresh. And it's setting out the partition table, and we're going to write changes to the disk, and that will write the partition table and allow us to install the operating system. And we're going to choose the whole disk, so it detected the size of that disk, and we're going to use that. And now it's actually going to write the changes to the disk. I was incorrect before. So it is writing all the partitions to the disk, and it's going to start the install. We're going to skip ahead. And grub bootloader, this allows us to boot the operating system. It'll find the kernel on the hard disk. So we are going to install it. And we'll install it on the only disk that is on the virtual machine. So we'll select that. And the installation is finished. So it's gonna finish up, close out of everything, unmount any partitions, and reboot. And now this is the grub bootloader screen. So you can do different boot options here, or you can just boot right into Linux using the default boot options. And it's gonna go through its startup, and we are there. We'll type in free to get information on memory, but this is in megabits, so we'll type -H to get the human readable format, which puts it into gigabytes for us. So here we can see the total amount of memory, used memory, free memory, and how much swap space is being used. And then top will give us all that information, but in a nice table format. The CPU usage, the memory usage as well, and that gives us free and used and total, and then the swap space usage, and then it will also list out the top processes that are being used by the system, and by default it is by CPU. And df-h, that is disk free space in the human readable format, so that'll show us all the partitions that are mounted, and the space that is being used. And that is the root partition, so that is the operating system partition. And you can see the mapper, because it's a logical volume manager, so it is logically mounted to SDA disk. And that is the boot partition, so that actually houses the kernel. So now we're going to open up the file that mounts the partitions during system boot. It's the etc fstab file. So we're going to go in there and take a look at the partitions that are mounted for this instance. So in here there's lots of information. You can see the boot partition is using the ID of the partition on the disk, and it is being mounted with the ext2 file system type. And then the boot partition is again being pointed to the logical volume name, and it is being mounted with the ext4 file system type. Alright, let's move around the file system. CD allows us to change directory. So the etc directory houses operating system configuration files, and we'll CD back to home. Home is where all of the user profile directories are, so that's personal data. And we'll use a handy shortcut to get back home, which is the tilde \. And as you can see, it brought us back to the home directory. And pwd is the present working directory. So now we're back at our home directory. Alright, let's do some searching through our files. So grep allows us to search the contents of files. -r is a recursive search, so it will search for everything underneath the specified directory. And so we can do a regular grep, which will search just in the directory, or the recursive search, which will search all of the subdirectories as well. So as you can see, we did a search for YouTube, and because we did the -r, it searched through all the subdirectories, but we were able to find the file that contained the word YouTube. So now we are going to search for a file using find. So find, and then we specify the directory that we want to search, and then -name, so what is the name of the file. And you can use wildcards here, but for now, for our simple example, we're just going to use a file name. We're going to pretend we know the name of the file that we're searching for. And then what do we want to do with those results? We're just going to list out the results to see the information of the file if it finds anything. And it did find the file, and it is in our home directory. Alright, now we're going to go SSH. So SSH is what is going to allow us to connect to a server if there is no graphical user interface. So SSH username, and then @ and the IP address or host name of the machine that you're trying to connect to. And since it's just a virtual machine that I'm using, and it's got a bridged network, we're just going to use the local address just so you can see the connection. And here it's going to tell you the authenticity of the server you're trying to connect to and the fingerprint of the SSH key. So you want to make sure that the key matches if you're connecting to a server after the first time. The first time it's a brand new cert or a brand new key, so that's fine. And so we're gonna accept this, and we're gonna type in yes to continue, and it's gonna prompt for a password, so we enter in our password for the account on the machine we're connecting to, and we're connected. Okay, we're gonna list out the attributes of a file so you can see the permissions on it. So the permissions on a file have three groups of 3. There's read, write, and execute for each section. The first section is for the owner, the second section is for the group, and the third section is for anyone else that has an account on the system. So the owner is me, Scott. That is the first Scott. The second is the owner. The second is the group. So owner Scott, group Scott. And we can change permissions on a file by using chmod, and then plus, and then or minus, plus or minus a letter. So plus R would be plus read, plus X would be execute, and plus RW would be read write, or read write execute. And each corresponding permission I'm going to change the execute permission on the file, so now you see there's an execute permission. And there's execute permission for each group because we did not specify a certain area to get the execute permission. We can also use numbers. So read is 4, write is 2, and execute is 1. And that follows the bits pattern. So if you want to change the permissions on a file, if you want to set read only, it would be 4. If you want to set read write, it would be 6. And if you want to set read write execute, it would be 7. So this way you can set permissions on a file just by using numbers. Either way is fine. All Linux operating systems support both. So if you want, you can learn one or the other, or you can learn both, whichever one is easier. So you can see that we're just changing permissions on a file based on the numbers that we enter. So as you can see, if we put 0, that means there are going to be no permissions for that area. So if we put 600, it's going to be read write for the owner, no permissions for the group, and no permissions for anyone else that has an account on the system. And now chgrp will change the group ownership of a file or directory. So chgrp and then the group name and then the file. And chown will change the owner of a file or directory. Alright, we're going to try and edit a file as a normal user, and as you can see, the file permissions are read only, so we are unable to make changes to this file. So we're going to use sudo to edit the file. So sudo and then the editor and then the file name, but we're not in the sudoers file, which gives us access to use sudo. So we need to edit the sudoers file. So we're going to su as root, which means we are going to become the root user, which means we have access to everything on the system. And we are going to edit the etc sudoers file. So in the etc sudoers file, we'll scroll down, and there are two main sections that we really need to worry about. One is the percentage and then group name, so percentage sudo. And that means anybody that is a member of that group will have sudo permissions. And then under user privilege specification, you can actually specify a username, and that person or that account will have access to sudo. And you don't really need to worry about the all parentheses all for now. That just means that gives us access to run any command as sudo. So now if we try and edit the file using sudo, put in our credentials, we have access to sudo now. And we also have access to edit the file because sudo elevated our privileges. Alright, package manager. So Debian package manager is apt, apt. So we can do sudo apt update, and this will update the repository of the packages. And we can do a sudo apt upgrade, and that will upgrade any of the packages that need to be updated on the system. And to install, we can do a sudo apt install apache 2, and the uppercase letter means the default. So the default is yes, we want to install this application. So we're going to go ahead and hit enter and install Apache 2. And now you can get started building out your home lab. And that's it. That wasn't so bad. Leave a comment down below if you've used Linux and what your experience has been. Hit the like button if you've used Linux but you've learned something new. If you'd like to see my first video where I talk about these 6 areas and why you only need to concentrate on these 6, see this video here. And that's all for me. Take care.